Welcome one and all to yet another exciting FSMA Friday where food safety is a celebration. Yes, I have my maracas with me right now. And yes, we hear from food industry experts on ways to make FSMA compliance easier and how to help nurture a strong food safety strategy. Now, today we're going to be looking at how climate related events have a direct impact on food production and where you should be looking to help you identify and prevent emerging food safety risks. Now, FSMA Friday is a monthly series brought to you by Safety Chain and the Atchison Group, whom I'm sure you're all familiar with, on the last Friday of each month. We not only share best practices and tools that can help you consistently meet FSMA requirements, but we also give you a chance to get some of your food safety questions answered directly from the experts from TAG. Now, just quick housekeeping here. We've muted all attendee mics, but we are leaving room at the end for some questions. So please, at any point during the presentation, please put your questions into the panel and we will do our best to get through them all. If we happen to run out of some time, then we will follow up with any unanswered questions. And yes, we are recording this presentation, so please do keep a lookout in your inboxes for the recording as well as the slides later on today. Now, I know we're going to have some fun today because we have back with us on Visma Friday Dr. Lily Yang. Lily specializes in how consumer behavior impacts the food ecosystem and supply chain, particularly when it comes to food safety risk. Lily, it's great to have you back. Now, this is a chunky topic you have on top for us today, so I don't want to waste too much time, but let's start off with a few FSMA updates before we hit on in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining today. I know that we're all interested in hearing about how our changing weather patterns are affecting food safety even now. But before we dive in, of course, we got to touch on what's been going on with the FDA. So, first and foremost, in case y'all haven't seen the cottage cheese traceability exemption, apparently last Friday, the FDA sent out its proposed exemption of certain cottage cheese from the traceability requirements. And in this final rule, the FDA announced its intention to consider exempting cottage cheese regulated under the Grade A pasteurized milk ordinance from the rules requirements. So, as we know, the PMO represents the most current science based knowledge and experience concerning the safe production and processing of grade A milk products, including, well, cottage cheese. And since the majority of the cottage cheese produced in the US is regulated through the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments, this co developed cooperative federal state program, the Interstate Milk Shippers Program, ensures the sanitary quality of milk and milk products shipped interstate. This proposed exemption would apply to all grade A cottage cheese that appears on the interstate milk shippers list as being exempt. Secondly, I just want to bring up as a reminder to everybody that if you're not already staying on top of FDA enforcement requirements, we highly recommend that you do. Finally, we also wanted to provide a few updates on a few recent warning letters that have come out, of course. I'm not going to name the companies because that would be uncouth. But something that I wanted to share with you all is recently the FDA has found that there have been a lot of issues with food safety plans. For example, when you are looking at your food safety plan, you need to talk about all your products. So I know we're in an innovation mindset these days. I know that we're trying out new different types of products, but you got to be including all of those in your food safety plan. Additionally, what are those ingredients that you are looking at, right? So you got to address all your ingredients, even those ones that you're like, man, we use this sometimes. Well, it's got to be in there. And finally, when you are doing your food hazard analysis, you got to remember to look at those environmental pathogens and list those out. And of course, one thing that we always talk about is allergens and the importance of making sure the allergens that you are making in your products are called out. And don't forget, in case you've been living under a rock, sesame is now the ninth allergen. And always important to be cognizant of your current good manufacturing practices and as part of the environmental pathogens, and also just in general, thinking about what Listeria monocytogenes is doing, both in your plant and in your products, and how that might be of effect. All right, so we're finally moving on to the big and dirty. We're going to talk, though, before that, we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about today. Before we begin, we're going to give you all a quick update about climate change, what it is, and what its current impacts towards food safety is. We will, of course, cover emerging risks, including both research and real life examples happening right now. And since we aren't here to just opine on these big issues, we will also talk about some strategies that companies are putting into place now, and also what research is doing and other practices that you might want to begin considering as you look ahead towards future proofing. And while we're talking about traceability, because traceability is real important, we'll definitely also talk about the intersection of traceability, climate change, and food safety. From there, we'll open the door to any questions you might have. But of course, before we begin, we got to set the stage. So let's define climate change. And while I recognize that this can be a hot topic, or this might be controversial to begin, you're probably tuning in from a place that has maybe experienced different weather patterns as of late. And really, that's what climate change describes. It just refers to the long term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns that can be both natural or generated by humans, also known as anthropogenic climate change, from our release of greenhouse gases, or from plants and animals, and also within the nature and the environment that we live in. This is brought to you by the United Nations Climate Action. But what does this look like, though, and how does this manifest? Well, if you're having an extremely abnormal summer, either it's really hot or much cooler than it should be, for example, for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, this is one of those such effects. So in effect, climate change is more or less climate variability. Different climate variations can be impacted by the amount of CO2, also known as carbon dioxide, in our atmosphere. It can be influenced by the rain we are getting or not getting, the UV that we are seeing or not seeing, humidity levels, etc., which can ultimately lead to changes in sea level salinity, crop yields, soil quality, nitrogen deposits, plant diversity, and even crop diseases. And as you see in this graphic, this climate variability can also lead to further extreme weather events, including floods, droughts, excessive heat waves, like we just talked about, and unnaturally warm winters, even. And boy, do those disaster events really impact us even now. All right, so why does this matter? And as we all know, the world we live in is interconnected. Seriously, think about that adage that we're all within quote unquote 6 or 7 degrees of separation. Well, that's the same as it is for our food chain, of which we, as we all know of, you are all part of, either within it or also as consumers. And even amongst that, we know that we're all also interconnected with the animals and plants that we are not only interconnected with, but we consume, but that also make up our supply chain, our manufacturers, our producers, and ultimately our consumers. Even now, we're connected with other plants and animals. And as we know, it's possible that pest, disease, plant and animal health will all impact our food productivity. And even in some cases, zoonotic disease spread, etc. And the thing is, climate change impacting food is a multidisciplinary issue, just like your food safety teams are multi-interdisciplinary teams when it comes to addressing long-term sustainability. Because ultimately, if we aren't able to produce safe food at the quantities we need, how will we be able to ensure food security? And I also understand that no one really wants to hear this, but it must be stated. Human activity since the Industrial Revolution for us to develop more food has altered our use of land, from forests to farmland to even industrialization, as part of food and beverage and more, and also, unfortunately enough, emitted the greenhouse gases and contributed to some air pollution. So today we will talk about how food security is impacted by climate change with changing crop yields, and also address food loss and waste, by which 14% of food produced in the country is already lost, as we know, before it even leaves the farm. And 70% of food for consumers is wasted at retail and households. But how does that relate to traceability, sustainability, and the interconnected global food system that we share? So, what are we saying now? But don't take my word for it. We are already seeing the impacts of these extreme shifting weather patterns now, and even in the past few years. Not only do we see impacts on plant growth, crop yield, and even contamination events, but we're also seeing changes in water use and water availability. Specifically, food hazard pairings are popping up more, increasing pathogen counts, leading to more both immediate and longer term issues, and ultimately trickling down to the consumer level and what we have for food security. So, looking at some of the examples that we have here, we do see impacts on plant growth, crop yield, and contamination in places like Hawaii. Over the past 2 to 3 years, there have been impacts in crop growth. Some years there have been too much water, and other years, farmers will go out and not harvest for 2 or 3 or 4 days or months straight, just because the weather pattern has been so extreme. And if you've also been keeping up with the news out in the Western growing region, this was an example brought by Dr. Stephanie Brown, who's now at University of Florida. Oregon berry season this year was crazy. In fact, there either they grew a little bit and then got inundated by flooding events, or it just got too hot and everything went down, right? So it was like walking through, as she described, walking through fields of berries that just smell like jam, like you could not harvest. But then, so what could you do with the remaining little yields of harvestable berries out there, right? And we'll talk about that. Additionally, we also see a lot of runoff, especially with flooding events in a lot of our in some of our growing regions. This flooding events then carries a lot of potential pathogens, potential chemicals into runoff, which then goes on to feeding different aspects. And we also see lower overall yields, especially in water starved areas. We also definitely see, in terms of altered water cycles, available water for irrigation and food processing. So if you are living in a place of drought, or you are manufacturing and producing in a place of drought, theoretically the water should be going to the people living in those areas, which may limit the water that is available, the potable water, excuse me, that is available for you to use within your facility. Or there might be water restrictions, right? Some places we are seeing around the world are having where they are Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, they can be functioning, and Tuesday, Thursday, they may not have water. We also do see a lot of excess droughts, excess floodings, and all of this also impacting how our water and our soil is acidified. This can lead to coral deaths, which have further implications that we'll talk about as well. Expanding more, we are also seeing an increase in the use of what we're seeing now. And something to talk about regarding flooding. Back in 20 years ago, flooding already accounted for 40% of all extreme weather events. And now we are seeing more of this, and it is increasing the microbial chemical contamination of systems and water. And finally, some aspects that you all have probably already heard of and seen is not only the impacts of food hazard pairing, which we'll actually dive deeper into, but also pathogen proliferation survival. So you think about like algae and those big fungus blooms, that's led by cyanotoxins, and that also impacts the safety of the water that we use. We've also seen, available arable usable land for food production no longer being usable because they've either been used up or there's just no water to supply there, and leading ultimately towards the availability of food security through food access. Food prices are increasing if there is less food, or maybe it's harder to transport food because there's just a longer cold chain that needs to be managed. And we are also seeing climate changes on food safety impacting food insecurity. And a good reminder of this is the Listeria outbreak in 2017-2018 in South Africa, in which, due to food insecurity issues, people were thereby going dumpster diving, getting food that was contaminated, eating that, getting listeria, and the system continues. So there is a wide range from farm to fork of climate change impacts that we are seeing now. And this graphic here further highlights those potential interactions of rising CO2. And this comes from Health 2016. And as you can see in here, we do see things like a temperature and precipitation extremes like flooding can increase the pathogen load, right? Climate can also alter the weed, insect, and fungal populations, increasing pesticide use, which can lead to the carbon dioxide also directly influencing nutritional contents in food, how that is impacted, warmer temperatures resulting in greater food spoilage, either on the production in the farms, on production, or during transport, disrupting food disruption and ultimately leading that to the ultimate consumer. Whew, that's a lot, right? But that's a good background of where we are. So we kind of need to then talk about the emerging risks and the impacts that we are aware of. So studies have been conducted about the current risks and future significant emergent risks, right? We do know that our food chain has become imbalanced due to certain factors we've seen and changes in the environment. Like we talked about earlier, acidified oceans leads to bleached corals, which impacts fish and shellfish growth, as well as an increase in carbon dioxide, also increases and influences shell calcifications for shellfish, which then reduces yield. We're also seeing an emergence and or a reemergence of pathogens in areas we haven't previously seen, either the slow migration of pathogens into newer regions, or even the permafrost up in the Arctic slowly melting and revealing once stagnant bacteria and viruses. Similarly, we also know that stressors to humans, animals, and plants increase our and their susceptibility to disease. So in this, I'm also going to point out to you, recently, EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency, put out an entire report on climate change as it impacts Europe. And we are going to focus also in some of these areas that they also discuss to help us discuss the remainder of this topic and these emerging risks. Obviously, there's the public health impact of biological hazards, and there is a lot of animal health and welfare and human health welfare crossover in this. We'll also discuss the public health impact of chemical contaminants, the animal health impact, plant health impact, and impacts of climate change on nutritional quality. Some more specific risk impacts, right? Well, let's talk about these increased incidences of food hazard pairs, whether they be from foodborne pathogens, pesticides, residues, and mycotoxins. For one thing, we know and we have seen that increased temperature rises has also increased the occurrence of parasites in freshwater fish and plants. Our detecting of new mycotoxin fungal species in corn in Europe, increase in salmonella in poultry, increased number of vibrio in seafood. Additionally, we see the decrease of rain in other places and humidity, leading to increased contamination of berries by norovirus and Hep A, internalization of pathogenic E. coli and salmonellas in leafy green vegetables, increased contamination of seafood by fecal indicator organisms due to water runoffs, as well as the splashing, dispersal, and aerosolization of salmonella infecting tomatoes due to the increased frequency of short periods of heavy rainfall. And as we all know, salmonella can survive a lot of things. We are also seeing, due to the drastic temperature variations, increased mycotoxin contamination by fungi in corn at the pre-harvest stage, and also because of pH and salinity issues or decreases in salinity, increases of bioaccumulation of toxic metals in different types of seafoods. We are also cognizant that because of these different stressors, there may be an increased use of antifungals, antibiotics, antimicrobials, which further drive up our antibiotic resistance. We do also see different new vectors happening, right? Different vectors for pathogens to spread and increase resistance genes. We all know that pathogens are very good at adapting to new things. Some pathogens are better at adapting to more extreme weathers than others. Salmonella is one of these, and there may be more increased resistance genes that are then transferred to one another. Aspects that we need to think about more specifically, cold chain management issues. Even today, as we are working with a specific client, and if you're also up here in the Northern Hemisphere, maybe part of that heat wave that's currently taking place this week in June throughout the Midwest and the Central Atlantic, and even those in the Southwest, maybe you're dealing with extra condensation issues, or your freezers and fridges have gone down due to having to make up for all that extra heat that is out there, right? And so these are the small impacts in a larger scale. And how are we going to get food transported across, right? And we think about feed quality. As we grow, as we talked about with the increase of mycotoxins, there is a potential, or aflatoxins, there may be decreased feed, or the feed may not be as good because of having to have stressors against different types of toxins. And as we talked about in increased flood zones, there might be pathogen internalization, and soil salinization changes also have a huge impact. And these are much more specific, depending on if you are a producer, a manufacturer, or even a co-packer. Let's talk about some of these impacts specifically on these input sides. So when we talk about land use, distribution, and arable land, right? There is less and less land being able to be used as we build more and more. So what areas of this land are we saving as we're thinking about climate change for actual production, right? On top of that, when we think about energy inputs, Energy inputs, traditionally come from gas or from coal or whatnot that release greenhouse emissions. But if that happens to be the case, this also impacts climate change. So, what other energy inputs that we can get from electricity that can form electricity should we be thinking about? Should we be looking at more renewable energy? One aspect, too, that is of limited resource is water, right? Especially in places where there may be droughts or in places where water restrictions have been put into place. How are you going to look at water inputs when it comes to potable water for your employees to wash their hands properly, for cleaning and sanitation activities, for irrigation activities? What will that look like? Do we need to irrigate less and then potentially stress plants more, but allowing us to use less water so they can just grow? Or do we use recycled water? These aspects we all need to consider as well as our human activity and what those manufacturing production impacts might be. Oof. So I know you're all like, oh my goodness, she has talked a lot about these risks, and we're gonna delve further into some of these relational hazards, right? So let's talk about biological hazards to humans. And it's also crazy to think about, but a lot of these also impacts animal health as well. Like we know, like we just talked about, we are seeing an increase of Vibrio species, specifically Vibrio parahemolyticus and Vibrio vulnificus in seafood, in the rise of seafood and shellfish. Or Campylobacter, norovirus, cryptosporidium, these are very high in the list of biological hazards to consider to humans as we look ahead as climate begins to shift and have variable actions. There's also increasing potential, as we know about biological hazards, there's an increasing potential for lower infective doses as pathogens attempt to infiltrate our system. This might be things like stec strains, parasitic protozoa, who continue to significantly persist in the environment. Other things, it is also well documented that some pathogens have higher stress tolerance responses to temperatures and pH. Again, E. coli, salmonellas, and other pathogens can travel long distance by the support of wind. For example, Coxiella. So all these aspects can both impact humans and also animals as well, and infiltrate the food system that we are in. Let's talk quickly about animal health and welfare. We also know that there has been a strong correlation of vector-borne diseases related to climate change. If we look outside of the food industry, mosquitoes and ticks already have, which are vector-borne disease, which are the vectors for specific diseases like Lyme and other illnesses, are traveling out further into warmer and more humid areas as other places are getting more warm and more humid. This, in turn, while this may be a public health human issue, may impact human productivity by human productivity of those individuals who may be working in your facilities. They also impact deer and wild game and can also have crossovers into our animal production food system that is part of our food supply. Thing like we just mentioned as well, different types of mosquitoes can impact all types of animals that are within our food system. This might include the Asian tiger mosquito, which is actually a very big concern. And so are parasites, the common household mosquitoes, Rift Valley fever virus, and viruses that affect ruminant animals, PPR virus. I'm not even going to pretend to try to pronounce this. In that, when we also talk about animal origins in food production, it is very important to think that if we are looking at the animals themselves that we are using for our food production, there are increased stress factors leading to disease susceptibility, right? So extreme warming is expected to cause changes in physiological processes for animals. This might be thermal distress. It might impair their feeding, their growth, reproduction, milk production. Additionally, although warming can also lengthen the forage growing season, but it may decrease forage quality, which is also impacted by rainfall changes, right? So we also see this in wild fishing and aquacultural vulnerabilities as well. We see that, if it gets hotter, we may get less production, we may get more parasites, we get more pathogens. All this, all animals in general are very sensitive to environmental stressors. And we'll talk about what we can do about this and things that can be impacted in our own food system to better address these issues. And of course, crops and plants make up the baseline of our food system, right? So when we think about this, there are certain types of plants that are plant health is heavily affected by rainfall, floods, blights, different rusts, different types of flies out there, the establishment of different insect vectors, and there is a high relationship to pests or parasites that we also see that will increase. So if we are unable to produce the crops that we are needing, or unable to produce crops with the nutritive factor and the quality that it needs, we are unable, therefore, to ensure our food security goals. And on top of that, if there are lots of food waste resulting from crops that have gone bare at the farm, this may also increase our greenhouse gas emissions as we try to figure out what to do with that food that may or may not be able to be converted into animal feed, or may just end up in the waste. And whenever we talk about harvesting crops that may be contaminated, we also risk chemical contaminants into the human food system, as well as any of these aspects impacting plant health. Two more aspects. We also want to talk about contaminants. As we know, contaminants can be aspects like mycotoxins, toxins produced by bacteria and fungi. All of these may be impacted by increases with relative humidity, or also changes in temperature and temperature fluctuations. I'm not going to read this giant list out to you, but this list has been determined, these lists of toxins and contaminants have been determined by EFSA to be of highest concerns right now as we look into increases and changes in toxin production. Finally, the nutritional quality of foods is impacted by climate change as well. Micronutrient deficiency due to lower concentrations of these micronutrients in plants has been shown to be related to increases in carbon dioxide. So things like having lower selenium, manganese, zinc, or iron. Oof, these are micronutrients that you and I and even our animal buddies all need. But if that decreases, how does that ultimately impact the end consumer consuming that? And finally, nutritional quality may be impacted due to changes in the plants or the foods that are consumed, which may lead to new phenotypes and new proteins, which themselves may lead to allergens and food allergies and things that we also need to be cognizant of, but are unaware of right now because these things take time to slowly show themselves. Whew. So what are some strategies and mitigation steps? Now that I've talked at length, or to death for some of y'all, about all the already happening and or potential stressors and issues related to food safety, and I know you're probably shaking in your proverbial boots right now, what the heck can we do? What can you do now? How can you future cast and protect yourself? Firstly, I'm going to put a slow plug in. We at TAT can definitely help you out, but let's start with some of the larger call to action, structural changes. And then we'll talk about interventions and sustainable activities and new technologies and other aspects that we can slowly make mitigation steps towards. From a larger call to action, structural aspect, I want to point out that each of us are capable as part of our companies, our suppliers, working with producers, as just general individuals, have the impact to advocate for policy changes impacting institutional and social structures affecting climate change that will make our world better. It's also very important to know where you, as in your company, wants to be. And in that, I'm going to bring up some examples that have happened. You need to do your research. Do not build your entire facility in a location that already has drought issues and then realize you need to abandon this facility. Yes, this has happened before, and no, I will not tell you to whom that these has happened to. But just know, that's not even doing your research. You should have done that work. If you decide to go Do your research for your food safety plan. Why wouldn't you have done that research before sinking millions into producing a facility? It is important to know where you want to be and what the impacts of your needed inputs are, and how that can also not only impact your bottom line, but the community of which you will be working with to hire into work for you for your bottom line. We also need to talk about energy usage, right? How does that look like? What is energy efficiency? How are you acquiring energy? Are you contributing to more release of energy and methanes and gases to the world? Or are you transforming that? And we do need to also increase our surveillance in the future forming vibes, right? As we look ahead, what are, besides everything we just mentioned, what is actually rising? What are the dangers, biological, chemical, physical hazards that are growing? We definitely also need to talk about messaging. And this messaging in the media, as part of information sharing, is also part of your food safety culture and training. But also, even if you don't believe in climate change, we can all agree that these weather patterns are affecting our business practices, including whether or not we can actually work and be somewhere, right? How does that translate to what you're sharing with your workforce, the communities that you are in, how you are doing that messaging, and also the long term sustainability of your company? Taking a quick look at interventions, some interventions that we can probably be looking more into is adaptive growing and breeding. There's research coming out behind what kind of plants are better susceptible, or excuse me, are better able to handle drought conditions, flooding conditions, pH imbalance. It is also imperative for us to intervene when it comes to understanding irrigation and runoff. And perhaps that even looks like modifying your good agricultural practices, things like changing your soil amendments, looking at what you're actually doing when it comes to harvesting, and implementing new technologies. There's a whole world of new and novel technologies coming out. You might think of CRISPR, gene editing, etc., which, remember, like everything else we do in food safety, must be validated. Even if you use these new technologies, we need to know that it is safe and that you, when implemented, will continue to have a safe product. So does that mean you need to do your due diligence to see if this novel technology will impact allergenicities? Yes. Are there additional risks, biological, chemical, or physical, that you haven't thought of? Well, you should be thinking about that. But these are all interventions that we can be thinking about. Additionally, we should be 100% promoting sustainable activities. And in this, I'm not saying, oh, just saying like, we are doing X and we have such and such certification that makes us look happy and pretty. And I know I'm looking at some of you and calling you out right now, but actually promoting truly sustainable activities. Looking at conservation techniques for water, for the land that you are working, for the space, and for your even supply chain. This might be even considering recuperation of resistant breeds. Maybe that's native breeds. Maybe they may be lower yielding, but is there something we can do to increase them because they will be able to better fend off against larger climate issues? And what are the biosecurity measures that we are implementing for disease control? We always need to be thinking about water management activities, right? Because potable water is so important. So does this look like different irrigation and feeding practices? Probably. Some places are looking at aspects like deficit irrigation. Deficit irrigation would be an example where you irrigate a crop at less than 100% of their watering needs. Yes, the crops are getting watered, but there is potential negative side effects to that, right? Because you are conserving water, great, but now this increases stressors on the crops that are being watered or the animals being fed. And then what does that ultimately look like in terms of the plant's ability, for example, to fight off pathogens? So that may have, so it's important, even though we are suggesting different aspects, to also understand that longer term impact. Places that may have less water or too much water. What are your water storage options? Should you be having water collection? And what does that look like to keep that water potable and safe? Looking also at your use of water within your manufacturing facilities. You should audit what your water usage in your facilities are. Are you just running water to run water? If you're running water to unstick product, is it necessary? And how much of that do you need? Or when it comes to even cleaning and sanitation activities, is there a way for you to conserve water by implementing a lower usage of cleaning and water for your cleaning and sanitation activities? And if you can, you obviously have to validate that, because are we sure it is a long-term solution? Some companies are already experiencing these issues and have had to make different changes to their cleaning and sanitation processes, or if they are in lower water or water regulated areas, they also take into consideration, if we have to close our lines 3 or 4 times a week, how will that look like when we actually utilize the water that we have or that we don't have? Again, it's also important to think of that in the longer game of the communities that you plan to work within, where you are producing and manufacturing, because while you may be considering about your bottom line, it is also important that if you are hiring from within that community, that they too have water for their own uses. Finally, it's always important to talk about human managers and support, right? In some of the examples that we talked about before, in Hawaii and also in Portland, where the crops are no longer being able to be harvested, you then have to address, and we should all be thinking about addressing those labor shortages. What does that look like? What does that, how will that impact the overall food system of your bottom line, of their livelihoods? And how can we also adapt and involve our stakeholders who are ultimately impacted? This may be a myriad of stakeholders from start to finish. And it's always important for us, obviously, as you are producing food, you obviously need consumers to buy it. So, and thinking about what the end user looking like, right? How will you get food to people that is safe and nutrition? How will you work on your cold chain management and ensure that safe food is carried through that cold chain? How will you ensure that the food you are producing contains all the nutritional qualities that it should be containing? And if it does not, how will that be made up? Some aspects that to consider as well, as we think about like having these foods at lesser yields or maybe destroyed crops, what food waste or food diversion might look like. Does this look like looking at more value added processing features? Does this look at, reforming and redeveloping what we are growing? Does that mean you have to shift crops to get used, right? And all this looks back at and ties into our favorite topic, food safety culture and management. Because ultimately, as you make these decisions, it has to be implementable and understandable from the bottom up as well from the top down within your company. And you always should have a backup plan for your systems. For all of this, always have a backup plan. And TAG can also help with that. Finally, because we always got to talk about traceability, what is the impact of climate change on traceability? Some questions you can ask yourself are, where do impact on traceability and sustainability? Excuse me. Some questions you might want to ask yourself: where do your impacts come from? How vulnerable are your inputs to any of the climate change factors, either that we've discussed? What are the extraneous sources of potential contamination? How vulnerable is your cold chain? How are you currently tracking extreme weather events and those impacts on your suppliers? What questions are you asking from your producers and your suppliers? How is antimicrobial use and or antibiotic use impacting your system? How is water use impacting your traceability and your whole system, and how that looks like as a sustainability factor? Again, a low plug, TAG can also help you out there. Whew. I know this was a lot of information at once, and maybe this was just the primer that you needed. But as we look ahead, companies like Safety Chain, who is working hard to connect all of us, and companies like the Atchison Group can be supportive and help you with conducting assessments, understand the sustainability of your practices, and what you may need to adapt as times are changing. I know this was a lot at once, and we went through a good portion, but provided you with the primer that you might have and some potential strategies as we look ahead, as you look to future proof yourselves. So I want to say thank you so much for being part of this talk. Thank you so much. And we are totally open now for all the questions that you might have.
Amazing, amazing job, Lily. That was fantastic. And yeah, a lot. I don't know how you got through all of that in the time that you did. That was incredible. But certainly so much here to digest and really internalize. And I think just looking at some of the questions coming through, a lot of folks are just they if I'm interpreting correctly, they want to understand how a little bit more. So I want to give a couple examples. You had said um how you go about tracking events such as weather or drought, things like that. I think, understanding resources, where can people go to find ways to understand what the water restrictions are even because they change or they fluctuate as obviously the climate is changing and fluctuating. And so keeping yourself abreast to all of those changes and not reacting to it, but maybe even being a little more proactive to potential changes is there resources maybe from TAG that you can share on this call?
Oh my gosh, this is such a good question. So we're talking about how to track events and resources and water restrictions, etc. As part of your supplier management, or even if you are a producer or a grower, you should always be asking those questions. You should always have backups ready, right? So let's say, for example, you are a grower and you are trying to understand how things are changing. This is why it's always really important to stay on top of what all the local and state, country, whatever type of system of information that you are getting from your governmental organizations. It is always important to subscribe to those newsletters because they do provide a lot of information on that. Additionally, to understand what is water restrictions, of course, this is a more case by case basis, but if you are in it, you probably already know. And if you are a manufacturer looking at asking your suppliers, some of these questions that we have up and discussed are questions you should already be asking your suppliers. A lot of this is also just news that you could be looking online. But on top of that, and how you can future proof yourself and being a little proactive, is also understanding where you might have a backup, right? Because as we saw an example of this, and I hate to bring this back up because we're already trying to move on ahead, is COVID-19. We saw issues in our supply chain, right? Supply chain, right? We suddenly had to think about where we're going to source X. And so at that time, people were scrambling. And if we have not learned anything from that, the one thing we should have learned is we should always have backups and things that we should be considering.
Mhm.
However, as it pertains to your question of, where do we track and the resources that are there, this is also a more individualized basis that I could totally talk
Right.
about at another time. So let me know if we're going to talk about that on a future FSMA Friday, because that's something we can definitely go into.
We are gonna take you up on that one for sure. Okay, good. Now, going back to you were talking about mosquitoes. You were talking about there's different types of bugs, fruit flies, that sort of thing. A lot of disease from these bugs, and it's very, very difficult to keep those bugs away from crops, from livestock, things like that. What can people do to do it safely without using chemicals or other things that have obviously environmental impacts to it?
That's a great question. So I am not advocating for the use or for the non-use of chemicals and environmental impacts. It is imperative to think of this. Remember, we talked about this being multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary as well. It is imperative that you consult experts in this, which in this case is not me, but there are actual experts out there who do discuss the rise in different types of vectors and how those can be controlled. And depending on the region, the country that you are in, public health officials are spending a lot of time working on not only spreading this information, but also how we can be more preventive in this. And this goes into the larger aspect of surveillance and also
Hmm.
being cognizant. So, not so much that we shouldn't use chemicals, but more so you should consult with the experts who in your region or the region of which you are of concern to better understand how we can holistically control these diseases,
Right.
these bugs, etc. Yes. Did I answer the question?
No, you did, and it's hard because obviously you prefer not to use chemicals and prefer to keep as natural as possible how you grow and process all of your food. But easier said than done. So you're right. This is a further conversation. Um, you had mentioned under a risk impact, increased resistance genes.
Oh my
That that
gosh.
was earlier on
Yes.
in your presentation. Do you mind going into a little more detail about that?
Yes. So to kind of be very like a blanket on this is the as we know, bacteria, viruses, etc. love to evolve, and they evolve at a much faster rate than humans ever will. But because, in stressed environments, only those that will survive the stress environments will continue, will therefore become resistant, and then therefore will continue to survive, right? And as we also know, amongst different types of bacteria, as they also evolve and change, they may also have bacteria sexy times and exchange different genes with each other. And as a result, we
Mhm.
will see increased resistant genes of like different types of pathogens due to the fact that they are more able to survive in whatever crazy environment is happening.
Yeah, that's insane. I mean, it's understandable, but it's like, how do you keep up with all of that? How can you possibly know when it's happening and prepare for it?
Uh, this is why organizations like WHO, FAO,
Mm,
EFSA, CDC, USDA, all the FDA, everything, they are on top of this. A lot of the academic studies that are out there, and as long as you're staying in tune with us here at FSMA Friday, we also keep you updated on what those updates might be.
sure. Well, let's talk about traceability here as we wrap up, because I know that was kind of one of your last points, and we know that the food traceability rule is upcoming. Um, you asked a lot of questions, and I think the big question mark for folks is this actually part of the food traceability rule? Do we need to make it or at least update our processes to incorporate things like, how vulnerable is your cold chain? Am I tracking extreme weather events?
I love that question. Climate change on its own, as this topic that we are discussing, is not technically part of the traceability rule. However, as part of the traceability rule, there is a lot that you should already be tracking, and some of this is going to be relevant. Does that make sense? When we're thinking
Yes.
about this from the climate change perspective and traceability together, it is important to ask these questions more so as a way to future proof yourself when it comes to thinking about the traceability rule. And these are all like secondary, tertiary impacts
Right.
that may come up in the future. So then why not think about it now so you don't got to be thinking about it later?
Well, that's kind of where I guess this line of questioning was going is that, it may not specifically call it out in the food traceability rule, but obviously it could be considered a root cause of potential hazards. And when
Yes.
that hazard arises and, there's a recall and you have to show, okay, well, what plot of land did this ingredient come from? You got to be ready to show that. And obviously that helps everybody to know that, okay, this was an area that was impacted by some type of event, etc. So yeah,
Yes.
it is related, and I would probably agree with you that in future versions of food traceability, there might be something obviously more direct regarding climate instances and how that impacts food safety.
That's affirmative. Definitely that. Thank you for putting that, wording that better than I do, because sometimes I get lost in the language of things and I'm like, what? So thank you for putting that into a nice little box, because that's
All
exactly
right.
it.
All good. All right. Well, Lily, I appreciate you. I appreciate everybody who has joined us today. We are running out of time, so we're going to call it. But okay, for the rest of you, if you have any questions regarding this topic or any other food safety topic, please do check out the Atchison Group at atchisongroup.com. Or, of course, you can head on over to Safe Chain's website where we have a ton of resources around food safety culture, food safety strategy, food safety planning, you name it. We've been working with TAG for a very, very long time in collaboration to create all of these materials to help you and your facility get up to speed quickly. So please do check us out. And of course, we hope to see you next time on our FSMA Friday series. We thank you again and have a great weekend ahead. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.